In this video, we're going to be talking about the analysis of categorical data and goodness of fit tests. Specifically, tests for homogeneity and independence for a two-way table. So, a study was conducted to determine if collegiate soccer players had an increased risk of concussions over other athletes or students. So the two-way frequency table below displays the number of previous concussions for students in independently selected random samples of 91 soccer players, 96 non-soccer athletes, and 53 non-athletes. This two-way frequency table is also called a contingency table. So the number of concussions, is our univariate categorical data. And it comes from 3 independent samples: the soccer players, the non-soccer players, and our non-athletes. The values in green are the observed counts. The values in blue are our marginal totals, whether they are row marginal totals or column marginal totals. And our red value is our grand total. So our chi-squared test for homogeneity is used to analyze univariate categorical data from 2 or more independent samples. So here our null hypothesis is that there is no difference in the true category proportions for all the populations or treatments. An alternative hypothesis would be that there is a difference in the true category proportions for all the populations or treatments. Our test statistic for our chi-squared is still the sum of our observed cell count minus our expected cell count quantity squared divided by our expected cell count. So our expected counts, assuming our null hypothesis is true, to get those, we're going to take our row marginal total and multiply that with our column marginal total, and then divide by our grand total. For our p-value, when our h sub o, or our null hypothesis, is true, and all expected counts are at least 5, chi-squared has approximately a chi-squared distribution of degrees of freedom of the number of rows minus 1 times the number of columns minus 1. The p-value associated with the computed test statistic value is the area to the right of our chi-squared under the appropriate chi-squared curve. So what assumptions do we have to have? Well, the data are from independently chosen random samples or from subjects who were assigned at random to treatment groups. And second, the sample size is large, so all the expected cell counts are at least 5. So if some expected counts are less than 5, rows or columns of the table may be combined to achieve a table with satisfactory expected counts. So here we've got our table, so let's state our hypotheses. So our null hypothesis would be that the proportions in each response category, so the number of concussions, are the same for all 3 groups. An alternative hypothesis would be that the category proportions are not all the same for all 3 groups. Now, to find our degrees of freedom count, we're going to count the number of rows and columns, so not including the totals, just the rows and the columns without totals. And then we're going to multiply subtract 1 from them, and then multiply those together. So here we see that we have got 3 rows and 4 columns. So we're going to have 2 times 3. So our degrees of freedom will be 6. Now another way to find our degrees of freedom is that you can also cover 1 row and 1 column and then just count the number of cells left, not including the totals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now our expected counts are shown in the parentheses next to our observed counts. So again, the expected counts are in the parentheses. Our observed counts are not in the parentheses. Now notice that not all of the expected counts are at least 5. So we're going to combine the column for 2 concussions and the column for 3 or more concussions. So now we have 0, 1, or 2 or more. So this combined table has a degrees of freedom of 2 times 2, which is 4. So if you have to combine rows or columns, you have to refigure your degrees of freedom. Now let's calculate our test statistic. So for our chi-squared, we're going to take our observed minus our expected, square that, and then divide it by our expected. We're going to do that for each piece, and then we're going to add all of those together. And we're going to get a chi-squared value of 20.6 here. So that brings us to matrices. Kind of reminds us of that. So here our p-value is going to be 0.001, which is less than our alpha 0.05. So since the p-value is less than alpha, we reject our null hypothesis. And there's strong evidence to suggest that the category proportions for the number of concussions is not the same for the 3 groups. So is that all I can say? That there is a difference in proportions for the groups? Well, we can look at the chi-squared contributions. Which of the cells above have the greatest contributions to the value of the x squared or our chi-squared statistic? So we see that these cells right here, have the largest contributions to the chi-squared test statistic. So basically what we're saying here is that really when we look at these 3 sets of values and look at those largest differences, that they occur between soccer players and non-athletes, with soccer players having higher than expected proportions in the 1 and 2 or more concussions categories, and the non-athletes having a higher than expected proportion in the 0 concussion category. Let's talk a little bit about chi-squared test for independence. So the chi-squared test for independence is used to analyze bivariate categorical data from a single sample. So our null hypothesis would be that the 2 variables are independent. Alternative hypothesis would be that the 2 variables are not independent. Our chi-squared test statistic is the sum of our observed cell count subtracted by our expected cell count, quantity squared, divided by our expected cell count. Now our expected count, again assuming that our null hypothesis is true, is going to be our row marginal total times our column marginal total divided by our grand total. Our p-value for when our null hypothesis is true and the assumptions for the chi-squared test are satisfied says that our chi-squared has approximately a chi-squared distribution with degrees of freedom of our number of rows minus 1 times our number of columns minus 1. And that the p-value associated with the computed test statistic value is the area to the right of chi-squared under the appropriate chi-squared curve. So what assumptions are needed? First, that the observed counts are based on data from a random sample. Second, that the sample size is large, so all expected cell counts are at least 5, and if some expected counts are less than 5, rows or columns of the table can be combined to achieve a table with satisfactory expected counts. Let's look at an example. The paper, Contemporary College Students and Body Piercing, described a survey of 450 undergraduate students at the State University in the southwestern region of the United States. Each student in the sample was classified according to class standing, so freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and body art category. So body piercing only, tattoos only, and then both tattoos and body piercing, and no body art. So is there convincing evidence, or is there evidence that there is an association between class standing and response to the body art question using an alpha of 0.01. So here we have our table. So let's state the hypotheses. Our null hypothesis is that class standing and body art category are independent. And our alternative hypothesis is that class standing and body art category are not independent. Now, assuming that our null hypothesis is true, what are our expected counts? So remember, to get this value, we're going to take our row total, our row marginal total, times our column marginal total divided by our grand total, and then multiply that by our observed value. So here, we're going to see our expected counts. So how many degrees of freedom does this two-way table have? So we don't have row totals here or column totals here. Or we don't have either of those things. And so we can take the number of rows and subtract it by 1, and then take the number of columns and subtract it by 1. And so that's going to give us a 3 times 3. So we'll have our degrees of freedom of 9. So to calculate our chi-squared, we're going to take our observed minus our expected, quantity squared, divided by our expected. We're going to do that for each piece, and then we're going to add all those up. And so we're going to get 29.48. That's going to give us a p-value of 0.001, which is less than our alpha. So since the p-value is less than alpha, we reject our null hypothesis. There is sufficient evidence to suggest that class standing and the body art category are associated. So which cell contributes the most to our chi-squared test statistic? Well, here we see that the seniors having both body piercing and tattoos contribute the most to our chi-squared statistic.